Hey there, Mama. You're listening to the Lift the Shame podcast. I'm your host, Crystal, mama of 5 and your family's intuitive eating dietitian, here to help you cut through the diet culture clutter so you can enjoy freedom with food as a family. I'm on a mission to help you end the generational legacy of diet culture in your home so you can experience motherhood free from food guilt and body shame. Listen in weekly for guidance on how you can ditch diet culture, heal your relationship with food and your body, and confidently raise intuitive eaters. Let's dive in and lift the shame together. Hey Mama, welcome back to the show. I'm so glad that you're here. I know it's been a minute since we've had a new episode released for Lift the Shame. We kind of had an unexpected podcasting hiatus and break, and so I appreciate you coming back. I appreciate your patience while we took a break with the podcast, and I'm really just looking forward to getting back into the groove, having more conversations with you, and supporting you with resources on your parenting journey, especially as you're looking to raise intuitive eaters and really effectively shift out of these generational cycles of diet culture and food guilt and body shame. We have so many great conversations in the queue coming over the next few weeks. And so I hope you'll continue to tune in. And again, just thank you so much for your support and your patience over our break time. So we're back. We are officially back. We're diving in. And today's conversation is something that I'm excited to just unpack with you because I've seen a lot of this rhetoric in terms of how we talk to kids about food. And I've heard a lot of conversations. I've seen a lot of things on social media. And I think that this is really important to explore. While there has been a lot of awareness around how we talk to kids about food and why that matters, I still see a lot of kind of subtle ways in which we are perpetuating diet culture through our verbiage and through the conversations that we have with our children about food. So while we might not be explicitly saying things like, this is healthier for you, this is unhealthy or good or bad, I think in general, a lot of parents are actively trying to move away from that kind of black and white thinking when it comes to food because we understand the damaging implications that that can essentially have on our children. However, I have still seen, and this is just talking generally, in a lot of conversations with other parents or especially on social media, I've seen a lot of prescriptive advice for how to talk to kids about food, especially as kids are getting older or having more awareness or hearing things or hearing conversations. There's this kind of gray area where we may still feel uncomfortable with how our kids are eating or the foods that they tend to show interest in. And we may not be saying, again, things like healthy or unhealthy, but there is definitely subtle ways that we can try to shape or get our kids to eat in a way that makes us feel more comfortable or in a way that we feel maybe aligns with how they should be eating in order to be healthy. And I'm saying that in air quotes because that word is very nuanced and there's definitely a lot that goes into that word. And so I wanted to have a conversation about this today and also just share a little bit of a story with you and kind of how I've seen this pop up in my own life with my own kids. But this is something that just happened recently where my kids went to a friend's birthday party and there was a piñata and all kinds of candy and things that they were able to bring home. And as they were kind of going through their candies when they came home, and I noticed there was a lot of different kinds of things in there, but one of my older daughters had a Rice Krispie treat with her. And on the package, it had said on its label, healthier Rice Krispie treat, low in sugar, using natural sweeteners. And, all of this was on the label for my kids to see. And of course, as my kids, I have older children, I have younger children, but my older children who can read and who can kind of hear some of these things and conversations that are happening with people around them were definitely cued into this. And one of my daughters asked, Mommy, is this Rice Krispie treat supposed to be healthier for me? And talk about feeling blindsided. I was like, whoa, because here in our home, we definitely don't use that verbiage. This is not something that I talk to my kids about. And I am a huge proponent of emphasizing things like all foods are good for our body. All foods serve a purpose for our body. We're safe to eat a variety of foods. And it just goes to show you that even being cognizant of those things or making intentional effort to talk about food in that way our kids are still going to be exposed to this narrative about food in other circles. And so hearing that from my daughter definitely kind of took me off guard. And then it also just invited a conversation about that. And it's interesting because I think food labeling is something that our kids are definitely becoming more aware of themselves as they're getting older, as they're more aware of what other kids are eating. And it's interesting, as I was going through their candy bag, I saw that was kind of the variety of candies that they had gotten, things that were labeled as low in sugar, healthy sweets. And, I always buy just the regular old plain Rice Krispie treats with the blue labeling, the blue packaging. None of that stuff is ever on there. So it was definitely different for my kids to be exposed to something like this. And before I delve into how I responded to my daughter and how I talked to her about this, I wanted to just unpack this a little bit more with you today. What do we do with this kind of information? Our kids are hearing it, they're being exposed to it. And, maybe this is something that at one point you were doing in your own home. And I say that not to create shame, but just to highlight how this is part of the greater narrative that we're in. And it's one that definitely emphasizes this diet culture message. It's rooted in diet culture. And the idea is that there are some foods that are better than others. And when we are seeded with these messages, whether subtly or indirectly or directly, and many of us grew up with this narrative in one form or another, it can make it very challenging to trust our kids with food. It can make it very challenging to navigate our food culture when certain foods are always a place on a hierarchy or emphasized as better than others. And this can create a lot of fear as a parent when you're learning how to feed your own child, or even feeling like you can trust your child to eat, right? Like when we are told, hey, there are some foods that are better than others. And again, it may not be as direct as like healthy or unhealthy, but just the way that we hear food talked about definitely creates this hierarchy in our minds where there are foods that we elevate over others. And I will tell you, the way that I see this play out with so many families that I work with is, again, this feeling of distrust, or this feeling of like, I am failing as a parent because my kid only wants to eat carbs. And we forget that carbs are actually a main macronutrient that our bodies need. And yet the narrative that has formed in our mind because of all these messages that we hear from diet culture makes us feel like we're doing our kids a disservice by letting them eat foods that they enjoy if those foods aren't in alignment with what diet culture purports is necessary for raising a healthy kid. So as another example, I see this all the time where a child may really be struggling with eating things like fruits and vegetables because those are more complex flavors and textures. And there's a lot that goes into learning how to eat. And yet as parents, we're inundated with this message that you got to get your kids to eat vegetables, or they're going to be picky, or they are picky. And this is going to create all kinds of food problems down the road. And so we subtly try to get our kids to eat in a manner that may not actually be within their capacity of eating. And this can create all kinds of conflict. And again, what I want you to see and understand is the subtle messaging that we are essentially communicating to our children, even if we're not directly saying, hey, this broccoli is healthier for you. You need to eat this. Even if we're not saying that directly, what is our messaging? What are we doing? How are we engaging with our kids? What are they picking up on from how they see us interacting with food? And again, all of this is shaping their mind and their narrative in terms of what they believe about food and what they believe about themselves. And again, I don't say any of this to create shame, but rather to just invite you into this space where you can safely explore what is going on within your own home, within your family, within your own relationship with food, because I know that you want to create a new narrative for your family and for your children, one that centers connection and trust around food. And it's really interesting because I think it can be really hard to let go of some of these old messaging that we have grown up with, that that has been reinforced in different ways that we've interacted with food ourselves. And so I really wanted to talk about this because, again, I'm seeing it pop up more and more. And sometimes it's not so much what we say. I mean, yes, what we say is important, but I want you to also explore, are your actions and the way that you engage with food aligning with the things that you're saying about food in your home or the things that you want your children to believe about food? So first, I wanted to kind of delve into here. I want to talk about some reasons why our kids don't need us to talk to them about what foods are healthy versus unhealthy. And we've had some variation of this conversation in different podcast episodes. So I'll link to those in the show notes if you're interested in going back and listening. But again, the bigger picture I'm wanting you to understand is why we don't need to necessarily tell or talk to our kids about like, this is what's better for you, this is what's not better for you. And again, the messaging that I'm hearing is much more subtle than the healthy versus unhealthy or the good versus bad. Again, I think parents are really trying to move away from that kind of language. But things that I'm hearing or things that I've certainly seen like on social media are talking about foods as in a way of like, this food has quick energy and we need to eat something that gives us energy for longer periods of time. So let's think about these foods like quick energy versus slow energy. That's a big one that I've seen. Still creating a hierarchy around food or foods that we should eat more of or less of. Like our bodies should eat more fruits and vegetables and less of candy and chocolate. Those are subtle ways that we are still creating a hierarchy around food in our children's mind. And again, what is the hidden message that we may be communicating when we talk to them about food in that way? It can be really what they're hearing is that you don't trust them to eat certain foods, and it can have all sorts of implications. And so this is kind of why I'm coming into the weeds and really want to pull out some of these weeds that I think are still lingering for us as parents, because we want to raise intuitive eaters. We want to trust our kids to eat. And yet we're still inundated with this languaging and messaging that, hey, you know what? If your kid loves candy and Rice Krispie treats, that's not okay. You need to shape their palate into a different way that will ultimately be healthier for them. That's a really confusing message as a parent. And sometimes when you're like, I'm trying to break free from this diet culture dogma, and there's still like, especially when it comes to feeding kids, these deep-seated messages that are hard for us to untangle. And so I really want to just lay it bare for you and help you kind of pull these things apart because it can be really confusing. Essentially, any type of languaging that is creating that hierarchy around food is still a dangerous place to be in. And it could be something as simple that these foods are doing more for you or less for your body, quick energy, or these are sometimes foods, or these are always foods, right? Or we start to kind of categorize them. Any type of language that is categorizing food is positioning some foods as better than others for our children. And really, that is highly rooted in diet culture. And we want to make sure that we're not communicating it to our kids that we don't trust them to take in the foods that they need. These are very subtle ways when we're grappling for this type of languaging that we're still looking for ways to kind of communicate to our kids that some food choices are better than others. And that's, again, communicating to them that they can't be trusted to feed themselves. And this is the big kind of overarching message that I want you to see is what are we communicating in our language? And what are our kids hearing or taking away from the ways that we interact or engage with food with our children? Because kids who feel like they can't be trusted to feed themselves are going to become adults who don't trust themselves to eat or to feed themselves either. And this is a problematic area, right? Like if you've struggled with a difficult relationship with food or your body, whether it's an eating disorder or you've been dealing with chronic dieting and you're like, I want to heal from this. I want to recover so that I can shift out of this so that my kids can experience food in a different way. I guarantee that you can trace back your struggles around food and your body to a time in your life where you started hearing or internalizing this message that your body could not be trusted. And this stays with us. It stays with us and it goes with us, and it informs the way that we feed ourselves, the way that we treat our bodies. And again, we don't want our kids to internalize this message that their bodies can't be trusted to eat, or that they can't be trusted to eat, or that they're wrong for eating certain foods that have been deemed as sometimes foods or not as good for you or junk food or whatever it is. Like when our kids start to internalize that message for themselves, it can really start to damage their relationship with food from a young age. So going back, sorry, I went a little bit of a segue there, but going back to reasons that we don't need to talk to our kids about food in any form of hierarchy, whether this is subtle or unsubtle. So as a parent, you might feel like it's my responsibility to make sure that my child eats in a certain way in order to ensure that they're as healthy as possible, right? And I think that's the intention for a lot of us. Like, we just want to protect our children. We just want to make sure that they really are happy, healthy, well-rounded individuals. And again, sometimes as a parent, it can be so difficult to feel like there's anything within our realm of control. As a parent, there's so many things that are not in control. And oftentimes feeling like we're micromanaging how or what our child eats feels like our ticket to control. Like, if I can manage this for them, then I will ensure a certain outcome. That can be a damaging place to sit in, because it can rob our children of the positive experiences that they need to learn how to feel and eat in a manner that feels best for their bodies. So let's talk about this. And I want to give you 3 main reasons why our kids do not need us to talk to them about food in any sort of hierarchy. And the first one here is that languaging around food that tries to steer them in eating in a certain way, whether this is healthy, this is unhealthy, really this type of languaging and this dichotomy around food grossly misinterprets health and what health is. So often we like to boil down healthy into what our kids eat. And it's really important to understand that health is so highly individualized, and it's very influenced by a multitude of factors, many things which are not in our control, like genetics, or maybe the environment that we're living in, or access to healthcare. Like, some of these things are not in our control. When we try to steer how our child is eating by talking about food through this lens of this is healthy or this is not healthy, that sends a very confusing message, not just around food, but around health in general. A lot of us feel like it's our duty to talk to our kids or teach them about nutrition concepts in order to help them and make different choices when it comes to food. But the big thing here that I hope you can take away is that kids don't need nutrition information in order to eat in a manner that is aligned for their optimal health. And really, I've seen so much confusion in kids from really early ages when nutrition concepts are introduced, especially prematurely, because nutrition concepts are so nuanced and very complex. And these are not things that our kids need to understand in order to eat in a manner that feels in best alignment with their bodies and with their health. And this is the hot water that we're stepping into when we try to interject these types of terms or terminology into our descriptive way of talking about food with our children. When we say this is healthy or quick energy versus slow energy, like, those are concepts that are very nuanced in terms of how things actually work in our body, and things that our kids are not necessarily going to understand, especially at ages 12 and younger. When we start introducing those things, it can be very confusing information, especially for brains that are developmentally wired for concrete or literal thinking. And I've talked about this before, but when we say things like, this is good for you, or this is bad for you, you shouldn't eat so much of that, our kids interpret that very literally, because developmentally their brains are wired to perceive information in that way. And so they can really interpret that to mean that I am bad for eating this, or, ooh, I am good because I'm eating these foods that are good. And that really is not the message that we want our kids to internalize around food. That can be a seed for food guilt and shame for years to come. And we want to broaden our understanding of what health and nutrition is and understand that our kids do not need a set of nutrition facts in order to understand what feels best in their bodies. Nutrition is just a complex topic, and it's something that involves a lot of biochemistry and metabolism and how different functions and physiology works in our body. And yes, maybe as our kids get older, there are some very subtle, basic things that we can teach them about. However, it is not necessary in order for them to learn how to eat in a manner that is best aligned for their individual bodies. And when we try to attempt to do our best to integrate some nutrition concepts in effort to get them to eat in a certain way, that is where things often go awry. Health for us and our children is so much more than just the foods that we eat. And again, when we are trying to put too much emphasis on food and how our kids are eating, or we're trying to, in our own direct way, micromanage the way that they eat, that is going to actually deter them from building a healthy relationship with food. So again, understanding the big picture of what is happening here and realizing that when we interject these health and nutrition concepts, even with the best of intention, it really has the potential to confuse what food means to our children. I know I may not have a very popular opinion here when I say that there really are no healthy versus unhealthy foods. That binary doesn't even exist in reality, because really all food is providing some form of nutrition. And yes, the amounts of micronutrients and macronutrients will vary depending on the food itself. However, saying or trying to categorize food as healthy versus unhealthy, especially for our children, is creating a binary that really doesn't even exist. We have to remember that food and nutrition are highly contextual. And, what might work well for me or for my kids may not work well for somebody else. And again, I think sometimes food can feel so overwhelming to many of us, especially if you're a parent who has had a tumultuous relationship with food yourself. And sometimes the overwhelm of food causes us to engage in things that help us feel like it's more controlled. And this is where I think this binary of healthy versus unhealthy really comes into play, especially as our kids start eating, or maybe eating foods that we feel uncomfortable with, right? Like if we can just kind of draw the line in the sand and categorize them, sometimes that creates this artificial sense of control or relief when something feels so overwhelming. But we have to understand that this dogmatic approach to food, in which we say that this is healthy, this is unhealthy, is highly problematic. This binary does not exist. All foods do provide nutrition in some form or another. And ultimately, nutrition is only one of the reasons in which we eat. There's so many contributing aspects of eating to our overall health outside of the food alone. Broadening our understanding of health and nutrition can help maybe relieve you from that need or responsibility to feel like you have to instruct your child in the manner of what is healthy versus unhealthy. That binary doesn't exist in the sense of there are foods that are actually healthy versus unhealthy. This is just a fun little example to throw in for you here, but I've seen this from various social media followers that have very large platforms and talk about feeding kids. And I saw one particular example where broccoli was highly elevated over chocolate and was actually described in the sense that broccoli does more for our body than chocolate. And that really set off the alarm bells in my mind, whoa. Actually, if we break down the nutrient profiles of both of these foods, did you know that chocolate actually has more micronutrients compared to broccoli? But again, that is irrelevant because both of those foods can contribute something to our overall enjoyment of food, right? And it's not about what has more macronutrients or micronutrients versus others. When we pit foods against each other in that way, it's so damaging to thinking about the broader context of eating. Eating is about enjoyment. It's about pleasure. It's about listening to our bodies and engaging and eating in a manner that feels good to us and eating a variety of different foods. It's not about one thing versus another. And I think getting into that frame of thinking about food in our heads, again, can be so damaging because we're viewing how our kids eat through that perspective. And I really just want to encourage you to challenge that and challenge that binary way of thinking, because it's not what food is about. That food is so much more than that. And food means different things to different people. And we don't want to cause our children to think about food through that binary lens, which is very rooted in diet culture and very damaging to their relationship with food and their bodies. A second reason here why we want to avoid using dichotomy language when we're talking about food, such as healthy or unhealthy, when it comes to kids, is that it actually can taint their ability to learn how to eat. And I want to talk to you about this study that really emphasizes and illustrates this point. So in this series of studies, researchers actually wanted to look at what is the potential impact of talking to kids about food through the lens of healthy versus unhealthy. And, the thought or intention behind this is if we can tell kids that foods are healthier for them, maybe that will deter them from making certain food choices or encourage them to eat in a manner that, again, diet culture purports is more aligned for health overall. And so in this study, this is really interesting. I love this stuff. So researchers had a group of preschool kids, and they essentially divided them into two groups. And they had crackers. They were looking at crackers, and they had Ritz crackers and they had Wheat Thins. And what they did with these kids is they told the children a story about a little kid who ate some Wheat Thin crackers before they went out to play. So half of the group of children were told a rendition of the story that emphasized that Wheat Thins were healthy and that they made this child strong. So Tara in the story ate some Wheat Thins and she felt strong and she had energy to go out and play. The other half of the children in this study, they omitted that piece about this child in the story choosing Wheat Thins to help her feel strong and going out and play. They were simply just told a story about a child playing. And then after the story was told to these children, they allowed the children to pick either a box of Wheat Thins or a box of Ritz crackers to take home with them. And what's interesting is that the kids who were given the message that crackers were healthy or that they made this child strong in the story were actually less likely to choose the Wheat Thin crackers to take home. They were more likely to take home the Ritz crackers. And this is in contrast to the kids who didn't hear that message. So the kids who heard the rendition of the story in which that piece wasn't involved, they took the crackers home kind of 50-50. So some 50% of them took the Wheat Thins, 50% took the Ritz. And this is super interesting. And I think this finding really highlights the fact that when we tell kids these messages that, oh, this food is healthy for you, this is going to make you strong, this is going to make you feel better in your body, that actually deters kids from naturally wanting to choose that food, whatever it is. And we've seen studies in the literature that highlight this in other ways as well, where when kids are told things that this is healthy for you, or you should eat this, or they feel any remote amount of pressure to eat a certain food, they're less likely to choose that food. And they're actually more likely to be adverse to that very food that we're trying to encourage them to eat, even with the best of intentions. So going back to this study with the Wheat Thins and the Ritz crackers, it's very interesting because really what it shows us is that when we try to tell kids that a certain food is healthy for them, it actually prevents them from naturally wanting to choose that food. It creates the opposite effect in which they're actually kind of repulsed by it, where they're like, okay, if you're telling me something about this food, then I don't want it. When we try to incentivize a food by somehow making it instrumental to something, it can create a conflicting message in a child's brain where they may start to think like, what's up with that food? Or it may not be tasty because it's created as instrumental. This is really important for us to understand. And it's these types of messaging that can actually kind of taint our child's natural curiosity and experience with food and with eating. And again, what's important to understand is our hidden agenda. How does it come out? What are we trying to do? How are we trying to influence our children when it comes to how they eat through our languaging and through our messaging? And is it actually creating the opposite effect of what we're intending? Really interesting and really important. And I love when we see these things actually demonstrated through mainstream research and literature, because it highlights the findings of things that we kind of naturally already know, right? So I want to read this part to you from the actual study itself, what the researchers noted and concluded. So towards the end of their research, they say, our research suggests that when encouraging children to eat healthy or neutral food, making the food instrumental may backfire. Emphasizing the taste benefits, assuming that they are credible, or even not mentioning the benefits at all, is superior to making the food instrumental to achieving certain goals in terms of encouraging consumption and creating a positive experience. Caregivers affect children's food choices by making specific foods available and by acting as role models for their children. So from the researchers themselves, emphasizing that when we try to encourage kids to eat, and then I'm adding quotes here, healthy food, making the food instrumental is actually backfiring. So by saying the food is serving this specific purpose, it's making you strong, it's making you fast, it's making you healthy, that's making the food instrumental. This is actually backfiring in allowing our kids to learn about these foods or consume them on a timeline that feels best for them, or learn how to explore them through this natural curiosity lens. So I wanted to highlight that as a point here when we're talking about thinking about the way that we're discussing food with our kids, conversations that we're having, the ways and the language and the words that we're using. Are we trying to leverage food in a way that is incentivizing our child to eat those foods? If so, it's really important to take a look at the effect of that. And that can actually be deterring your child from naturally wanting to learn or try these foods on their own. I will actually link the study for you in the show notes as well if you're interested in reading this further. Last point here that I want to talk about in terms of the detrimental effects of healthy versus unhealthy languaging or any variations of that, and why we want to avoid it, is that ultimately it separates a child from their intuitive eating abilities. So really any hierarchy around food can be internalized as rigid food rules, which these are a hallmark characteristic of eating disorders. And I know that you're listening to this podcast because you want to learn how to decrease your child's risk of eating disorders, right? Like, you want to end the cycle with you and not be it something that's passing on to future generations. And so we have to understand the different influencing factors that create our narrative in our mind about how we think about food, how we feel about our bodies. And ultimately, eating is driven by internal motivation. That's what intuitive eating is. When we eat intuitively and we eat in a manner that is conducive with our bodies and our body's needs, that is eating that is characterized by internal motivation. How does something taste? What are the sensory components that align with what feels good to my body? Is this pleasurable? Is this enjoyable? Does it feel satisfying? Am I connecting with somebody else? Am I experiencing joy in sharing this meal with somebody else? Those are all internal motivating factors that influence or should influence how we eat. And this is all, again, very characteristic of intuitive eating. And this is how our children naturally are driven to eat and to make food choices from the foods that we offer to them. And this is something that we want to preserve as much as possible, right? Like, our kids already have these innate abilities and we want to preserve that. However, if we are creating any type of external criteria for eating, whether it's making a food instrumental, or we are creating hierarchy around food by highlighting that some foods are better than others in whatever type of language that we're doing that is actually separating our kids from their internal cues. That is driving the focus of eating from being something that is internally motivated to now something that is externally motivated. There's now an external value for eating, which separates us from listening to our bodies and being able to respond and honor what our individual bodies need. And so we really want to avoid leveraging any type of nutrition information, especially this nutrition information and health information that's highly rooted in diet culture, as a way of shaping or trying to steer our kids to eat in a certain manner, because that is deterring them from actually listening to and responding to the internal motivating factors that are naturally driving their eating choices and their eating behaviors. So this is really important to understand. And I want to emphasize this point here, that when we are trying to steer our kids' eating patterns or eating behaviors or eating choices to align with arbitrary rules that are rooted in diet culture, that is also communicating the message to them that we don't trust them, that we don't trust them to listen to their bodies and to the internal cues and motivating factors that are driving their eating choices. So that is the underlying message that we are communicating when we are approaching food through this manner of hierarchies, of talking about food in a black and white perspective, of watering down food to be good versus bad. These are all the consequences that can result when we are engaging around food in this way. We want to think about, how can we preserve our children's natural intuitive eating abilities? How can we communicate a message around food that highlights and emphasizes trust and connection? Because what we know is that when kids are able to eat in alignment with their body's internal motivators and internal cues, that actually is what best supports their overall health. And I'm not just talking physical health, I'm talking mental health, emotional well-being. All these things are preserved and all these things are optimized when our kids have a good relationship with food. It is not just a checklist about trying to get our kids to eat certain foods over the course of the day, or not eat certain things, or get them to eat more vegetables. It's all about emphasizing and preserving that they are the best experts of their bodies. And we need to focus on our jobs with feeding and offering them a variety of different foods and trusting them to eat what they need from the foods that we are providing, without our hidden agendas trying to influence them to eat in one way versus another. And really, this boils down to trust. Can we trust our kids? And how can we communicate that message to them so that they can internalize that trust in themselves? And that trust component is so key to preserving their innate intuitive eating abilities and to allowing them to experience and have a positive relationship with food over the course of their lives. Again, I know from conversations with so many of you, and I know from my own experience with my eating disorder past, that so much of the conflict I felt around food and my body revolved around this narrative that grew and built over time in my mind, that I couldn't trust my body, that something was wrong with my body, that I needed to change my body, that I needed to change my appetite, that the things and the foods that I enjoyed were wrong. And all of those things shape a very tumultuous relationship with food and bodies. And I just want to encourage you again to continue to think about food and health in this broader context, because it is so much more than just the things that we eat. And when we can start to really trust that and believe that and center a connection-based relationship with our kids around food, that is so key and important to really shifting these cycles of food guilt and body shame. So I wanted to just lay that foundation, and I realize I'm going to be leaving you a little bit on a cliffhanger here because I didn't finish my story with my daughter and the Rice Krispie treat that she had that said healthy on it. So we will pick up next week. I will talk to you about ways that you can approach food and how you can talk to your kids about food in a manner that doesn't perpetuate shame or guilt, or that doesn't separate them from intuitive eating abilities. So we will talk about that next week. I'm going to give you some pointers, some ways to approach food in your home, and some ways to talk about food that completely avoid the hierarchy of healthy versus unhealthy, good versus bad. And I'm also going to share with you how I talked to my own daughter when she asked me if that Rice Krispie treat was healthier for her. So if you've had a conversation with your child child, or if your child has asked you, is this healthy for me? I know that can leave us kind of with a bunch of question marks. Like, what do I say? How do I approach this conversation? And I would love to share with you how I approached it with my own daughter. So I hope that you can come back next week and join me for that conversation. We are going to finish this conversation for sure. And also, just to kind of preview what's coming up, I'm going to be having a few episodes on navigating feeding our children. If you are struggling with an eating disorder or disordered eating, or if you've been chronically dieting and you're like, I don't want to do this anymore, I want to show my kids a different example, we're going to be having some upcoming episodes on navigating those things while feeding your own children. So if you have any questions about this topic, I would love to hear from you. I would love your input, and I would love to just know what's on your mind so I can address these in our upcoming podcast episodes. We will also be having a series coming up on picky eating. So if you have questions about any of these topics, please connect with me. You can always send me an email over at hello@crystalcargis.com. That information is in the show notes for you. I'd love to hear from you and just know what questions are on your mind so I can answer those for you here on the podcast. And I also just want to end the episode acknowledging Mother's Day, which at the time of this recording is coming up here in the United States. And I realize that this holiday can be fraught with many mixed emotions, especially for those of us among us with damaged or non-existent relationships with our own mothers, or those who are aching to become moms, moms who have passed, moms whose children are ill, or those who have lost children, and other complicated reasons. I know that this holiday can bring up a lot of mixed emotions. And I just want you to know that you are seen and that your stories are not forgotten. We see you, we are with you, and you are so loved. So wherever this finds you this coming Mother's Day, I just want to wish you a happy Mother's Day and thank you for being here, for being part of this community. You are so loved, Mama. The work that you are doing to end generational legacies of diet culture and food guilt and body shame, it matters. Everything that you're doing matters and is making a difference in the lives of your family and your children. And I am just so grateful to be a very small part of your journey. So thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Lift the Shame podcast. For more tips and guidance on your motherhood journey, come connect with me on Instagram @crystalcargis. Until next week, Mama, I'll be cheering you on. Bye for now.